Hi, everyone. Hi, thanks everyone for coming tonight. I'm Marty. I'm the marketing manager at Oregon State University Press. I want to thank PNBA for sponsoring tonight's event. I want to thank the indefatigable Curtis Lowe for moderating, and of course, Tina Ontiveros for writing this remarkable memoir. I first heard whisperings about the manuscript that would become Rough House at a PNBA trade show a couple of years ago. And I know I speak for all my colleagues at OSU Press when I say how delighted we were when Tina brought her manuscript to us. Her decision to publish with a small university press, I think, is a reflection of her commitment to independent publishing and to the literary community here in the Northwest. Many of you know Tina already, but for those of you who don't, she's a writing instructor at Columbia Gorge Community College and a book buyer at Clint's Booksellers in the Dalles, Oregon. Now, Rough House is a story of growing up in turmoil. It recounts a childhood divided between a charming, mercurial, abusive father and a mother struggling with small town poverty. It's also a story of generational trauma, especially for the women. It's a story of violent men and societal restrictions, children not always chosen and frequently raised alone. Although it's firmly rooted in the logging camps of the Pacific Northwest at the end of the 20th century, Rough House is so much more than a regional story. Tina casts an uncompromising gaze at the small towns and backwoods of her childhood, and she speaks plainly and with certainty about the strength that can be forged from struggle, and she affirms our shared humanity and the redemptive power of love. So I'm really excited that you're all here tonight and that Tina's here. Before we get started, as you're coming in, please mute yourselves. You're welcome to leave your cameras on if you like. There will be an opportunity after the presentation for people to interact directly. But in the meantime, if you'd like to send your questions and comments through the public chat window, I'll be moderating that and I will forward those on to Curtis as we go. So with that, I'd like to turn the virtual podium over to Curtis Lowe.
Thanks so much, Marty. What a privilege this is. And thanks to Beach Books and Alexa and Karen for suggesting we do this and cornering me into doing this. But what a nice idea to speak amongst all of us, to get to know Tina a little bit better. Many of you have already read the book. Many of you have submitted Indie Next nominations. In fact, we had a very healthy number of nominations. In fact, at least 25 that got Rough House onto the Indie Next list for October, which is quite an accomplishment. I thank each and every one of you who also were sort of halfway through it and you were trying to find the time to read it. I just feel like this book is such a rewarding experience. I really love the fact that we're in some ways reading it together. And I think that we're all poised to share in the success of this, which I highly anticipate the success of this through the fall. Tina, would you like to say anything about the Indie Next announcement?
Thank you, Curtis. I want to say thank you to you, Curtis. Can you guys hear me? Okay.
Yes.
And obviously to everybody, like I think everybody that nominated is probably here tonight. And I know you guys have other things you could be doing tonight, so I'm just really grateful that we're all together. But I also want to acknowledge, Curtis, that I think your advocacy had a lot to do with that win. And I think everybody here knows that, so I'm really grateful.
Well, thank you. The way that tonight's going to work is we're going to have Tina read a little bit to us. I have some questions. We're going to go back, Tina and I are going to go back and forth a little bit. We are going to debut a book trailer, about a 5-minute book trailer that OSU had commissioned that I've had the pleasure of seeing a few times. It really is being seen by booksellers for the first time tonight. And then after that, we will open it up to sort of more wide-ranging discussion and sort of a denouement of chat and sort of casual conversation. We want to make the most of this for all of you. So Tina, you know, many of us have read your work. Many of us love your work, but few of us really heard you read in your own words. Would you read to us a little bit?
Sure. I'm going to mute a couple of, there we go. Okay, so I don't think this requires much setup, except to tell you that that there was a point in my early childhood where we had lived on and off in a 15-foot camp trailer, a family of 4. And there was a point when my mom talked my dad, Lloyd, into getting us a 35-footer, which she referred to as the mansion. I think everything else in this little section is self-explanatory. Mom finally convinced Lloyd to settle down in Clallam Bay, Washington, before Jesse started first grade. Crown Zellerbach was the second largest lumber company shaving the surface of the Pacific Northwest back then, and Lloyd was lucky enough to get on their payroll. He was proud to be a company man, though it wouldn't last. For many years, I'd feel that pride linger a moment whenever I saw a white metal Crown Zellerbach paper towel dispenser in a public bathroom. When we first got to Clallam Bay, we lived in the mansion. Before long, we sold it and rented a big double wide in a trailer park on a bluff looking down on the ocean. This was the kind of trailer that actually needs some furniture. It wasn't all built in. Sometimes when Mom wanted to make dinner in peace or go to the laundromat alone, Lloyd would say, "You kids want to go on a wander?" He meant a walk on the beach. There was never a time we didn't want to go. I could have a bellyache and a fever and I'd still go on a wander. We'd walk on that beach with Lloyd as long as he'd let us, no matter how cold our faces or fierce the wind. I had a powder blue pea coat with polyester white fur lining that I thought was so pretty, though it had belonged to another girl before me. It wasn't even a little bit water resistant, but I didn't care. You know how sometimes you're listening to a song you love and all you can think about is restarting that same song as soon as it's over? That's what it was like to walk on the beach with my dad. Lloyd stopped often to stoop down and point things out along the shore. He'd gather seashells or bits of interesting flotsam. Not just gather, consider. He might hold up a piece of broken shell and ask, "What's that look like to you, hun?" He was really interested in my interpretation. He'd ask if I could imagine it as the head, foot, or body of one of his seashell creatures. He used a hot glue gun to put together shells and create silly figures, some on 2 legs, some on 4, 6, or 8. He'd add plastic googly eyes and take them down to a tourist shop and sell them. Our beach walks were collecting missions to gather shells, driftwood, moss, and rocks for his critters. But it was about more than collecting. Lloyd would hold up a piece of driftwood and ask us to look at the way the sea had shaped it. We discovered mermaids, dragons, wiener dogs. Driftwood can be anything, and Lloyd never got tired of that idea. It's just plain wood, but also a tadpole, a giant's pointer finger, a long, skinny Ford pickup truck.
Okay.
He taught us to compare today's landscape with yesterday's, to observe the way the ocean kept on changing the lines of our walking. Nothing's stronger than the power of the sea. Nothing's got more slow patience, not the coastline with its craggy bluffs, not the mountains or the rivers or even the forest. I lived in a small body then, and when Lloyd knelt down to talk to me, to show me the miracle of an unbroken sand dollar or newly forming inlet, he looked like a man at prayer. What I mean to say is that he made me feel like I deserved to take up space. From his moments of careful attention, I learned to expect some amount of worship from the world. From his violence, desperate apologies, and absences, I would discover that the same sparkling fires that fueled his creativity could burn out of control, leaving a landscape stripped of life. Lloyd would hurt and fail me in 100 ways, but first he taught me to wonder, gave me love without condition, and moments where I felt holy.
That's terrific, Tina. Thank you for doing that. You know, having known you for the last, 12, 14 years, I know you have a lot of stories to tell. I'm really always interested in hearing why you chose to tell this one first.
That's such a good question, Curtis. I've actually been thinking about it a lot because obviously I've got a lot of interviews lined up and I'm trying to figure out, it's hard enough to write a book about yourself, and then it's a whole nother layer of hard to talk about it because you're just talking about yourself a lot. But I think when you say why this story now, the first part of that question, why this story, you're referring to, you know that I've got other projects in the works. I actually have another book that is fairly well drafted that takes place at the same time as Rough House, only it's the flip side of my experience when I was with my mother, which was a very different kind of poverty than I experienced when I was with Lloyd. But I think a practical reason would be it was a lot easier to bring Lloyd's book to completion first because he's dead. And I think the idea of being the subject of books, it makes my mom and my brother very nervous. So they were like super I remember a few years ago, Kim Stafford was reading, and I brought my mom when he was promoting 100 Tricks Every Boy Can Do. And I brought my mom to see him. And at the end, he took questions and she raised her hand and she was like, "How does your mom feel about you writing this book?" And I was like, "Mom, don't be nervous. Like, I would never do anything that makes you uncomfortable." And so I think this was a nice way to sort of ease them into the idea that I write about our family. But also, I think it's more than that. I've come to this place where I pretty much look at everything through the lens of class. And I worry sometimes about the deficit of stories by people who, you know, aren't well off. And I don't know, I was just rereading one of my favorite memoirs, which is Heartberries by Therese Marie Myatt. And she talks about this idea that self-esteem, she thinks of self-esteem as like a tool white people use to take up more space in the world, or to, you know, and I think there's something to that idea that marginalized people are often told to be quiet. And so I don't know, I think maybe the more educated I've become and the more financially stable I've become, the less shame has power over me. And so the more I've started to feel almost a moral imperative to share those stories. I don't know if that makes any
No,
sense.
it does make sense. Actually, that really brings me to the next question, because you're talking about taking up space or having a voice. And I'd like to ask you about voice in this book, who you're speaking for, who you're speaking to. It's very accessible. The focus seems to be on the events, but also your ability to look at yourself in the future, from the future, and think about who you were and who Lloyd was and who everyone in your family was, and how have compassion for all of them. But I'm asking about voice.
Yeah, that voice was kind of a big, you know, it's a memoir, it's the story of my family, but it's also, as Mary Karr would say, a made thing. Like every part of it is something that I've thought about and crafted. And voice was really important to me because I think language is often used to marginalize people. And you know, I didn't go get an MFA because I was looking to be a published writer. I actually, when I was young, I faced a lot of barriers, particularly to higher education. And when I went to college, or even just grammar school, high school, I always had a sense that like I could tell that I didn't speak the way I should. And I have this image of like when we left my dad for good, my mom almost immediately started correcting our speech. And she would constantly say, "Ain't is not a word." She would constantly say, "Jesse and me." Like my brother and I still always say to each other, "Jesse and me, Jesse and I," because I would always say Jesse and me, and she'd be like, "It's Jesse and I." And she knew there was something to that. She understood that language would shape our experience, but she wasn't super educated either. So she didn't always get it right. Like I remember being in middle school and using Jesse and I and being corrected, because it's not always the right thing to say. But my mom was just like, "No, you never say me and Jesse. You always say Jesse and me." And so, I mean, I think I always knew that language was something, was like a gate. You know, it can be used for gatekeeping. And so when I was writing the book, you know, and also the reason I got an MFA wasn't necessarily get published, but it was because I wanted to teach at community college. I wanted to be a different kind of gatekeeper for as many people as I could. And I feel like community college is a place to do that. Like I went to community college. I always volunteer to teach comp classes. Like I teach all the creative writing, but I also usually teach comp classes for students who aren't quite college ready. And it's always like the first day talk I give them about how whatever their voice is and however they speak in their family of origin is welcome in my classroom and honored. And of course, when they write me papers, I have to make them learn how to write the King's English or whatever, you know, but I want them to understand that that is something they shouldn't lose. And so I guess I was sort of putting my money where my mouth is when it came to Lloyd. And it was also, he's dead. But I had it in my head the whole time that I wanted it to be an approachable book if he wanted to read it. I remembered there was this time that I went back to Lloyd, and I was always schlepping a couple books with me. My mom would take us to Salvation Army and let us buy books. And usually she'd only let us buy one. And so I thought I was really smart. I would always pick out these like the Reader's Digest books that have like four, like I didn't know about abridged books. So I thought I was reading like 4 whole books. And so I'd always be carrying these kind of fat books to his house for the summer. And I remembered a time that he asked me about the book I had, and I told him about it. And then I said, well, what kind of books do you read? And he was like, oh, honey, Daddy doesn't read books. For some reason, my dad always talked about himself in the third person to me. And so he was like, Daddy doesn't read books. And I was like, why not? They're cool. And he was like, well, they make me feel dumb. Like, I'm not a very good reader. I don't have book smarts like you. And I remember him telling me that the only thing he liked to read, I don't know if you guys will remember this, but back in the day, the Reader's Digest magazine, which is written for like a 3rd to 5th grade reading level, they would always have these true stories in them that were like always an adventure of somebody surviving like a plane crash or some terrible accident on the side of a mountain or whatever. And he was like, now Daddy really gets into those stories. And every now and again, Daddy treats himself and buys the magazine just to read that one story. And so I think I just really wanted it to be approachable. Plus, I mean, if you grew up, anybody here who grew up as a code switcher knows, whenever I went back to my dad, I changed the way I spoke. And that was a respect thing, like, so that he didn't feel intimidated by the ways I was changing the more educated I became. And everybody who does that knows exactly what that's like. You just immediately do it. And I just felt like I needed to do that as best I could if I'm going to take him and expose him like this, the least I can do it was just in my head that I needed to do that.
Well, you're telling the whole story of your father. I know there are probably, stories that you've left out, but you give a whole picture of who he is. So far, you've talked about the positive influences he had in your life. And I want to read this piece by Meg Olson. She's the owner of Kingfisher Books in Coupeville, and I see that she's on the call right now. She wrote, by the book's end, she definitely delivers on her promise in the opening line. He's not a good man, but you can't help but like him. Can you talk about how the book starts and why you began it that way?
Yeah, so I wrote like 8 different starts to the book, and I still have one that I kept meaning to make better and use. But I ended up deciding that the beginning, which is called Like Riding a Bike, was what needed to stay there. And there were 2 reasons. First, that first line of like, you won't think he's a good man, but you would like him, is that like the whole point for me in large part of Rough House is to kind of interrogate this idea of who is a good person, because I think it's far more common for poor people and marginalized people to become known for their worst acts than it is for people who have money and social connections. And so the idea that he might be a bad man or a good man is something I'm concerned with. And I get it. If you guys have read it, you know that Lloyd did some pretty bad stuff. But I know a lot of people now that I'm in the middle class who do some pretty awful stuff, and we give them privacy around it, and we consider it a misfortune or a blip in their sort of story. It doesn't become their whole identity. And I think as a society, we have made it our business to really often come between poor people and their children through social services and through the prison system. We take a lot of dads away from their children. And I think that my dad didn't do me more harm than good. So that was kind of part of that. Is he a good man or is he a bad man? The other reason was that I'm just like, I read a ton of memoir as I was writing the book, like I think between 45 and 60. And so it was structural. Like I noticed a lot of memoir starts on the grave. Like we're always like, the person we're writing about the most is dead, and and then we're going to go back and relive the experience of that person. There's just certain ways that I notice they tend to sort of be structured. And I wanted to start with just a roadmap. Like, here's what you can expect from this story. And I thought that the bike riding was a really good way to do that. Like it was a really good example of a sort of a simplified example of the ways that every interaction with Lloyd always came with some pain and with some joy.
That's great. Speaking of sort of context, can you talk a little bit about when the stories take place?
Yes. You know what I just thought of today? So I was born in 1976. So that's Rough House spans from 1976 to 2001, which is when Lloyd died. But I was thinking today, yesterday was the 100th anniversary of women, or at least white women, getting the right to vote.
Mhm.
And it got me thinking about, like, when I was born in 1976 in Orofino, Idaho, my mom had a medical condition called RH factor. And she needed treatment for that, which was 2 shots. She needed one before I was born and one after I was born that would prevent like catastrophic problems in future pregnancies. And Lloyd was raised a Jehovah's Witness, and his mom was very much martyred because she was the kind of woman that tolerated the sort of abuse that Lloyd and the men in his family dished out, and was just pious, and she died young, so she was sort of martyred. And so even though he could never quite toe the line, the Kingdom Hall line, he sometimes imposed that on us, particularly my mom, because I think it was a way to control her. And so when she needed this shot, he didn't want her to get it because it was a blood product. And he was able to prevent her from getting a medical treatment that she was requesting because the hospital wouldn't let her have it without his signature. And so then she turned around and said, fine, I will get my tubes tied. I will prevent, any other children. And he wouldn't sign that, and they wouldn't let her do that either. Which is crazy because it just doesn't seem that long ago. And I don't know why you asked me about timeline, and I totally went off there, Curtis, but I was just thinking of that date when I realized that yesterday was the anniversary of the 19th Amendment. So, but anyway, as far as timeline,
African American women didn't get the vote until 65
yes,
with the Voting Rights Act. It's stunning,
yes,
isn't it? So that's why it's a little bit of it's a celebration,
yeah,
but it's also, it gives you perspective, absolutely.
Yeah.
So yeah, timeline 76 you were born, and this is a story of...
Yeah, so, late 70s, mostly the 80s, early, like I graduated from high school in 94. So we left Lloyd in 81. So that kind of gives you an idea of the touch points.
Yeah, okay. And that also, speaking of context, as a sales rep, a book that's from my territory is really attractive usually. A book that touches on every single part of my territory is almost never happens. And so Marty has created a map that shows all of the places that are mentioned in Rough House, which is a lot of fun. And I know I've sent it to some of you, and we're gonna sort of revise it a little bit. But Marty, are you there to show that map so people can look at it? And great. And Tina, you can speak to it a little bit?
I think there are even places missing off this.
There might be even.
We moved so much. My mom has no idea. She can't even count how many places we lived in my first 5 years. And then once my parents split, my mom stayed put in the Dalles. But Lloyd continued to just migrate, like, not even anymore like a migrant farm worker. I think of it more, like I say in the book, like a wolf. Like he had a territory that he was sort of always moving around, and he would burn bridges and skip town and then go end up somewhere else. So while he was always kind of around the same areas, I didn't often live with him in the same place twice. So yeah, Alaska, I don't even mention it in the book, but Lloyd actually lived in Alaska quite a bit in my late teen and early, like, young adult years. And that was a period where we were kind of on tough terms. Like, we weren't full on estranged, but we were sort of on the mend. So I never went and spent time with him in Alaska, but I did go live in Ketchikan with my brother, who was a Coastie. He was in the Coast Guard. And I went and spent some time with him in Ketchikan when I was a young adult. The California stops, those are all places that we lived just maybe for 2-3 months at a time when my dad was logging, except Rescue is where my mom was born. Jackson is where my mom met Lloyd, but he was there logging. For a while, my mom's grandpa was this sort of shady guy who always had these weird, like, I don't think legal businesses that he would start up. And for a period, he had a small logging outfit in Jackson. Idaho, we were living in headquarters when I was born, but that's an unincorporated logging town that doesn't have any services. So I was born an hour away in Orofino. And the book kind of starts with that moment where my mom, she had to have a C-section, but Lloyd didn't come to get her from the hospital because it was 4th of July and that's his favorite holiday. And he was already sort of drinking with his buddies. And so she had to drive herself home. And she told me that she set me, I was in like a cardboard baby carrier, and she set it down on the seat next to her. And the first time she took a corner, I just sort of slid out of her reach and landed against the door. And I thought that was a pretty fitting start for me. Sandpoint, we were living in Sandpoint when Lloyd went out one night and got drunk, and he came home. This isn't funny. Why am I smiling? He came home and he got upset because the door was locked, and we were living in this little one-room studio that we were renting for a while, and it was a whole bunch of them that were the same, so a whole lot of loggers living in the same area. And my mom wouldn't open the door because she was like, oh, he's really drunk, I don't want him in the house. And so he busted through the window on the door, and he kept reaching in to try to undo the lock, and she grabbed her cast iron skillet off the stove and just smacked his hand without thinking. And then once she'd done that, he was so mad, she just had to continually do it until somebody called the police and hauled him away. And funny thing, that is the only, I have that pan.
Oh.
My mom gave it to me. Louisiana's there because Lloyd's people came from Louisiana and Alabama. And when I was 3, we took a Greyhound bus all the way to Pitkin, Louisiana to visit his family. And the last night we were there, he went out with all his buddies, and he ended up, the police called like early in the morning because he was in jail, and he'd been in a bar fight and he had a few broken ribs. So we had to ride home on the Greyhound bus with him in pain. And then Oregon, most of the touch points in Oregon have to do with my life in the Dalles, but Camas Valley is the town that Lloyd lived in the longest. He landed there when I was probably, 15, and he pretty much lived somewhere in Camas for the rest of his life. He did move around and sort of make his little squats in different places around town, but he sort of became a fixture there for the final years of his life.
Yeah, that final scene in Camas, when you meet him at the Chalet Cafe in Camas, is one of the most memorable scenes of an attempted reconciliation with your family.
Yeah.
So many great moments in this book. I want to read this quote by author Kim Stafford. He's been a champion of your work from early on, and he writes a question that he thinks your story answers. He says, what is it like to be a refugee in your own country, to be a child in exile from safety, waking each day to search for some provisional sense of home? Is that what you're showing us? You're some sort of a refugee?
I don't think so. Like, I'm a little cautious with that word because I don't know that word really belongs to me. I think, even though I think Kim Stafford is a brilliant genius and a national treasure, but I don't feel like I would use that word. Although, I mean, the weird thing is we were disjointed and we were afloat for so long, but it didn't feel that way when you're a little kid and that's all you've known. It doesn't feel that way. I felt very confident in my dad and my mom and my family unit. You don't know any better. It wasn't until the night we really left Lloyd for good, which we had left him a few times before then, but I don't remember any of them, but I do remember that. And I do remember it did feel like, it felt like we were untethered. And I sometimes think, when I think of like refugee mothers coming across our southern border right now, many of them are fleeing a similar kind of domestic violence. And I do think of my mom during that time. You know, she did have her kids. She didn't really know what her future held. She had enough gas money to hopefully get her to her sister's house, you know, that she had to literally scrounging up change, because she understood the time might be coming that she would need to make that break. But yeah, I wouldn't say that was an intention I had.
But I think you answered that well. You know, there's so many great quotes. I just have to thank everyone here and those who aren't here who wrote in and described the book and posed questions about this work in their own way. I think it's so thought-provoking. Tina has posted a book club guide. She's sort of been working on that. That's going to be available on our website. A lot of my questions were inspired by the reviews that came in. And I see that DJ Lee is here, author of another OSU title, Remote, Finding Home in the Bitterroots. A story, a different kind of way of talking about story, really through the landscape and the history of that part of Montana and northern Idaho. DJ, I just want to say, it was hard for your book to land when it did. January, February, trying to get out there. One of the biggest challenges we're going to have as reps and readers is to see what got missed during that time when everyone was sort of in survival mode. And I just want to thank you, DJ, for writing your book, and I'm committed to continuing to get it into booksellers' hands. But you write so beautifully about right? Violence is a natural element of this rugged environment, but so is tenderness and fierce love. So Tina, can you speak to that?
Well, it's a beautiful review, DJ. Thank you. I love the whole thing.
I'm taking parts of it.
And we are doing some events together, so keep an eye out for that. Yeah, I mean, I thought it was a huge compliment because it was something I really worked on. I really tried to sort of, I think there are memoirs that I would probably characterize more as autobiography because they're just sort of a chronicle of events. And I think I prefer a memoir that does sort of play with that, like holding sort of opposing truths up and just sort of looking at them and not really deciding one way or the other. I tend to be like, I really am drawn to the essay form, and essay is really about curiosity and wondering and sort of questioning, and you don't really have to come to a solution. And I think there were a couple books like Mark Doty's Firebird, and I don't know if you've read Rebecca Solnit's Far Away Nearby, that are just sort of about like wandering through and questioning and not really having to decide that one thing is true. And I think that this quote sort of speaks to that tenderness, but also violence. Like we can hold opposing truths up and sort of accept them both. And I think that that's the work of turning truth into art.
Another author, Jonathan Evison, writes, Ontiveros is as vivid in her descriptions as she is unflinching in her honesty. Will you talk about that? Again, it comes to voice again, but...
I love him. Remember when we were hand selling revised fundamentals, and he's just so great.
Sure. He's camping in Solduck right now. He'd be joining us, but he and his family...
Solduck's on my map!
I know it is. I told him that. I mean, I shared the map with him, but he would love to join, but he just can't right now. But I do appreciate him taking the time.
Yeah.
Great book coming from him in June, Legends of the North Cascades. I'm extremely excited about it, but you've already expressed interest in reading it and blurbing it. So it's one big family, isn't it? But can you speak to what he's saying there?
Yeah, again, I mean, like DJs, you can tell when writers write these reviews because they know about the work. And that was huge for me. Like, it's a really big deal to me that to use the tools of fiction when writing memoir. And that means you do have to, create setting and build scenes and character, which is so hard. Like, I think of myself as two different characters when I write memoir. Like, in this case, there's that child body who's running around through these landscapes and living that experience with Lloyd. And then there's this Tina who's looking back on it. And I don't know, I studied a lot of memoir, and it was really important to me that that level of detail that he's sort of talking about be there, that immersive sort of world building. And then what was the second part he said? You said the detail, and the honesty.
Brutal honesty, yeah.
Yeah, that's rough.
Yeah.
That's really hard. I mean, I think you can sense that in the book, that there are moments when this character is really struggling with how honest to be and how much to expose herself and her family. But again, I think it just sort of goes back to that idea of how I'm looking at the world through the lens of class and just the experience of poor people. I don't want to represent any other poor person than myself and what I experienced at that time, but I wanted to force myself to not let the sort of power of, I think that we are kept silent because it makes things easier on those who already have all the power. And so it was just important to me to push past that.
I want to read a quote by Renee Kirkpatrick, who, I'm sorry to say, I don't think she's going to be on here. She fell. She's a fantastic bookseller. She had a fall and she's recovering from a broken patella. And it's going to be a little bit of a long road, not maybe until October she'll be back in the stores, but she's one of my most, reliable touchstones for perspective on all sorts of books. We all know what an avid reader she is and an avid sharer. She actually, Renee, many of you know, she grew up in a coastal town, an Oregon town, and in a poverty that she found was very familiar. And she writes, there are brilliant spots of love and joy throughout, show that family is family is family. Family makes us who we are now, regardless of where you grew up or who grew you up. Can you talk about what you learned from your family and what you think that means for others?
Yes. First, I have to say that I think Renee is a writer.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
I love her blurb. And that was one of the first I got, because I think you shared with her like a manuscript.
I gave her a page manuscript. We were talking about it and she was eager to read it. And it was one of the things that really I realized we have something special here.
Yeah,
You're always surprised when people who don't know you like your work. And it's like, this is the game. And people aren't just being nice. I'm
always like, I'm bought that person a drink at Flirts once. They're just being nice.
Flirts. Oh, we all know Flirts. And
so yeah, that was another reason Renee's was really meaningful. Is like, I don't know Renee well, and I know that Renee is a kind of a tough reader. So I was just like, plus it's a really big deal when somebody who grew up in a similar way, because it was so important to me to be super respectful of everybody, of my dad and everybody in his community. So yeah, that was huge. As far as family goes, I mean, I think the big things would be that, first of all, it's surprising to me how lonely it is for me to be like in the middle class now and to have the family bonds that I experienced growing up. Like, we were always so just pushed so close together, and we were always facing some sort of chaos or I don't know. It creates a different sort of bond, and it's in a weird way. We don't have those same bonds. The other thing I would say is that I sometimes worry that my kids are too sheltered. Like, I spent like half my life trying not to be Lloyd's daughter and trying to iron out my language and get an education and do all this stuff. And definitely that played out in my parenting. Like, my kids were my primary focus, and they were going to have, like, I worked just to pay for like piano lessons and anything like that they might need. And then I got to a point where I stopped and kind of sat back and looked at everything. And I think as the more educated I was, the more I realized that so much about the shame I felt as a child did not come from my family. It came from the rest of the world. And so I wished that I had sort of exposed them more. I kept them separate from a lot of my family of origin because I was worried about the ways addiction and a lot of the problems that come with poverty would bleed into my children's lives. And again, that's the thing we do. We punish the poor rather than tackling poverty. And, I didn't know any better. I was constantly just trying to get ahead, but I definitely hit a point where I was just like that. I did my kids a disservice, which is a good thing because now they can read this book.
Right. I'm going to read, we're at the point where I think I'm going to read one more quote. It's a longish one. I'm going to read this quote, and then if we can all mute our mics, we're going to debut the trailer. And afterwards, we'll open up mics for more of an open conversation. This quote comes from Deborah Reed. She's an HMH author, actually. Her forthcoming book is Pale Morning Light with Violet Swan. She's the recently new owner of Cloud and Leaf Bookstore in Manzanita, and I've gotten to know her over the last year or so. And she wrote, I read Rough House in a single sitting, unable to break loose from the tension of what might happen next. It is the story of a childhood gone wrong in the wilds of the Pacific Northwest, twisted and tangled before it finally is set to rights. Reminiscent of Raymond Carver, if Carver had been given a voice to the women and children faced with the troubles and misdeeds of men. From the myth of a larger-than-life father racked with addiction and rage to a steady and clear-eyed mother who remained at the center of her children's orbiting lives, Rough House chronicles a past that haunts a young girl who, like her father, is filled with a legacy of anger, but like her mother, is determined to reshape how her own story will end. So,
I should give credit to Steph because she's here. Steph Sweetie is on this call, and she made that video.
Wrong, ambitious women every day. Laura, I couldn't help the poor kid who picked on me because my big sister would be there in a flash, ready to have
You're
my
muted, Curtis.
oh, sorry. Yeah, I think we're battling with our controls, so we should all be unmuted now.
and there's no union
I'm unmuted. I just want to say thank you, Tina.
every Sunday night.
That's all. From Ballard from Secret Garden. Thank you.
Oh, thank you. You're welcome.
That's just beautiful.
And so many girls around the world who look
Does anybody have a question?
like to move the world as
Oh, Christine says she has a question.
phenomenal women in their own unique way. I love you. I admire you.
Did your brother ever dispute any of your memories? That's a really good question. He did not. I think my brother was really nervous. He sort of felt like it's better to just leave these things alone.
Intelligence.
And we've turned into very different people. Like, he's more conservative than I am. He definitely buys into the sort of bootstrap ethos more than I do. But he read the book before I was like, this won't go anywhere if you guys don't, if you guys aren't cool with it. So my mom and my brother both read it. And that first draft, first of all, there was a very painful experience for him because he had been asleep. I don't know how many of you have read it, and I don't want to ruin it for you, but there's a part when my dad takes a very violent action toward my brother, but my brother was asleep when it happened. And I thought my brother knew about it all these years, and he didn't until he read that draft, which just made me feel awful. But he told me that even the parts where he remembered the actual situation being different felt really true to him. Like, he was like, it just feels like your experience of that. So, because I was like, if there's anything in here, if it's the wrong brand of car or the wrong size trailer, tell me and I'll fix that. Or if it's just Tina remembered it completely wrong, tell me and I'll fix it. And he was just like, no, there's nothing I would change. I feel like the chat went by so fast. Did you catch the questions, Marty? I saw.
Yeah. Have you learned anything since finishing the book about Linda and her whereabouts?
Yes, I have. Who asked that? That's a great question. Alexa. So I wanted to try to have Linda read the book before it was published because she's a really important character and she's very exposed in the book. And I love her. I just really wanted her to have the chance to contribute. But I had a lot of trouble finding her. Anybody who's read the book will know that Linda, my stepmother, was with my dad for probably 20 years. And she, when my dad died, I gave her a prepaid cell phone, which she had for, I don't know how long, but basically it ran out of battery and she stopped using it. And every year I would send her pictures of my kids, general delivery. That's the only address I ever had for my dad. Whatever town he was in, general delivery. And so I don't know when she may have stopped receiving those. You know, they were never really great at staying in touch. So I did do some research. I'm not on social media. I know I'm lame, but Linda's not on social media. I can promise you she would not be on social media either. But I did some research, and I did recently find a death notice for Linda from 2017. I know. So, which seems probably about right. I can't imagine. I want to know so much about her. Part of me sort of hopes I'll find her daughters through this process.
Another question from Karen, Beach Books. How did you deal with Lloyd after the situation with your dog?
Well,
So what happened?
we bottled it up and we didn't talk about it. And he took me to Kmart and bought me a Cabbage Patch doll. I mean, I wasn't the power structure didn't allow me to really be mad at him. You know, that's not how that works. It's you suck it up. And like I think I described in the book that like he came in and you could tell he was trying to be sorry, and I just sort of turned my back to him. But I knew never to push too far because I never knew when it might turn on me. So he was definitely like apologetic, but he would never come so far as to say sorry, because he wouldn't even come so far as to admit what he'd done. He still tried to live with this lie that the dog had escaped. So.
We had another question from Brian from PNBA, wants to know why you chose to have the title of your book and your author name all lowercase, and to treat it that way, not just on the cover of the book.
Well, because I always considered us a lowercase people. And I just felt like, and I don't think that's a negative thing. I think it's a beautiful thing. It's like the whole other sheep thing. And that's just what felt right to me. I wish I could give you a more like theory-based reason, but I just felt like we're lowercase people, and that's how, and I remember because Kim was like, do you intend to have that be lowercase on the cover? And I was like, yes, I do. I can't totally explain it, but yes, I do.
I will say, hop in here and say, it's really been nice watching the collaboration between you and OSU, and how well Tom and Marty have listened to what you wanted, the way that you saw it.
And Mickey and Kim, if you're here, it's just an amazing team at OSU. All of them, it's like 2 thumbs up. And a
And there's
wonderful.
Ronnie, hey Ronnie. I'm trying to unmute you. You're the one who brought up Rough House, I'm sure of it. I think you came up with the title too.
Well, it was already a chapter title. So
Right.
the book used to have a different title, and there was a lot of talk about how maybe we needed to change it. Christine just asked if the camper on the jacket is one of our photos, and we meant to talk about the book jacket.
Oh, please do, yeah.
It is not a camper we lived in, Christine. But when OSU kept like sending me cover comps, hi KJ. I always shared them with my brother. And when that one came, he was just like, oh my God, if Lloyd saw that trailer, he'd be like, kids, we're home. And I was like, totally, he would see that as an opportunity. Like, that is the kind of trailer. In the book trailer, you may have noticed there was a trailer with like a part of a frame built on the side of it. That was the place in Camas Valley where Lloyd died. So he ended up building that out 3 times. So it was just like this huge shack. And that shack with the tarp on it, like, we lived in that. But yeah, the cover that Curtis is showing you, I don't know if you guys noticed, but I think OSU did a beautiful job. But the sun is actually like a crosscut, and that line across the top is the Oregon-Washington border, which was sort of a clever little Easter egg. I want to say hi to Amber and Aspen because I only see them but once a year.
Hi, everyone.
Hi. Where's
Hey,
Aspen?
Where's Aspen?
Hi. What did you say?
Where's Aspen? I'm trying to find
Just on
you.
the
Here.
phone.
Her video's not on.
Yeah.
Oh.
Oh, Aspen.
She said she had a
But
book
there really
envy.
there are going to be opportunities in the virtual booths. You know, they're going to be live for 30 days, and I'm going to be booking a lot of meetings. I'm booking a lot of Zoom meetings to show books right now. And Amber and Aspen, I'd love to
away.
books at some point, and give you a little tour of what
Totally.
you're seeing in person if you're open to it.
Yeah, totally. Sounds good, Curtis.
Yeah.
Amber, are you saying you know somebody from Sandpoint?
Yeah, one of my good friends. Christian, she grew up in Sandpoint, Idaho, and I think her dad was a logger, or did he work in some other industry?
Oil. I think he works on
Oil.
oil. Yeah.
Okay.
Hi, Christian.
Hi, Tina.
And she said that her whole life she's been trying to escape her class, and I was wondering if that is showing up for you, if you identify with that feeling as well.
Absolutely. I think I spent like half my life doing that, and now I'm spending the rest of it kind of undoing a little bit of that programming and trying to have a little bit more of a nuanced view. But certainly like that rural life doesn't appeal to me. Like there's the class issue, like just being poor, but also like, where are you, Laura? I don't want to live in Idaho. We just had that conversation today. Poor Laura is having so much trouble right now. But yeah, and you know, somebody else in the chat asked about my sister. So, and that kind of goes with this question. So out of the three of us, my sister's the only one who has not kind of pushed up beyond the federal poverty level. And it is something people ask me sometimes. And sometimes I feel a little insulted when people ask it, because they'll say things like, why is your sister such a mess? And you're okay, you know? They're not really considering the sensitivity of that question. And she's actually, I would say she's fallen further below the poverty line than my mom lived. My sister's not in a great place, but I think actually her older daughter was a big inspiration for me in publishing the book, because I felt like I wanted her, when I mentioned the children, those are the children I'm thinking of, because they're in the woods right now, like they're in the hard part. And I just want them to understand, like, that's not all there is, you know, that my sister's, she loves her kids, but she has a lot of the illnesses that we kind of think of as coming along with generational poverty, and that has consequences for her children. And it's definitely something that we all kind of build a network and help her out, because she's not always able to care for them like she wishes she could.
One last question, Tina, and then we should wrap up because it's
Okay.
8 o'clock. Was there a moment when you decided to forgive your dad? Maggie wants to know.
Well, I think there was that moment when my husband, Ronnie, who I think is on here somewhere. Hi, Ronnie Rowe.
Ronnie.
When Ronnie, look, Ronnie, there's Christian. When Ronnie sort of made me, I almost didn't put that scene in the book that you were talking about, Curtis, because it was just so freaking convenient. Like, it just doesn't even feel real. And so many moments with Lloyd, there are others that I just didn't put in because they feel too much like they're made to be in a book. But that one was definitely a moment like that, where it was just like, Tina, come on. Like, you drive up and he walks out the door of this restaurant right as you pull in. Like, there were just moments that just felt like they were meant to be. And I think there was just that moment, a lot of the anger and frustration sort of just bled out of me. So, but I can't say that, you know, a lot of it came like 20 years after he was dead too. So it's a process.
Marty, you think we're wrapping?
I think it's just about 8 o'clock.
Yeah.
So I'm happy to hang out and see all your faces.
We do know we have book shipping in early September, probably landing about mid-September. We were nervous about not seeing the book on the September list, but then October makes so much more sense because you will have books in plenty of time before the printed edition, because they're starting to print it again. The Indie Next list will be a printed brochure. I just discovered today that Jennifer Green of Green Bean Books, her quote has been selected to be included there. So we appreciate her. I think there's some crossover potential for this book, Green Bean being a kid's book store, but I really think it's going to be a fun hand sell. Fun is a lazy word, but I think it's going to be a satisfying hand sell this fall. So getting a lot of stuff in the quote in the text here, but you know, in the Pacific Northwest, I'm your guy to talk to about orders and events. I see Grace here. Grace has been helping with doing things at University Bookstore. I know that there's Northwest Commons is doing something too. So this is a nice opportunity, I always think, to get to know how Tina would be in an event, and streaming events seem to be more and more frequent, and I think they're getting better. And one of the rules that we're supposed to have is that we keep it under an hour, and now it's now 8:01, so I'm gonna stop talking. But please reach out to me. I'll probably be bugging you about orders because I'm a little worried about selling out of stock when it releases, and I wanna make sure all the independents are in good shape. So Marty, do you wanna close us out?
I don't have much to add. If you want to place an order, talk to Curtis. If you want to book Tina for an event, she's handling her own event schedule. If you need help with marketing or just general questions, let me know. Thank you all for coming out.
Thank you, Marty. Thank you,
Thanks,
Curtis.
everyone.
Thanks, Marty. Thanks,
Have a good
Curtis.
night.
Thanks,
Bye.
Tina.
Thank you all. All right, bye-bye.
Bye, everyone.
Night.
Bye.
Bye, Tina.
Thank you. Bye, Aspen.
I have major bookcase envy.
I love your face.